If you're a fan of the story of civilization and you are excited to know just what it was like during the age of one of the greatest philosophers and just one of the most interesting characters in European history, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I will be covering The Age of Voltaire by Will and Ariel Durant. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking on the 9th volume in the Story of Civilization series. As you know, I've been slowly going over this series over the last couple years. I make it a goal to read 10 pages a day in this series so that I can finally make it through all of the books so they don't just look pretty on my shelf, but that I can actually tell you that I've read them and that I have a greater appreciation for what they cover. As usual, let me start with the full title of the book. I think that gives a better understanding of the scope. This is one of the books where the idea, the concept of being based on an individual, particularly in this case Voltaire, could be a little misleading, although I will say right now that this book does follow Voltaire by and large. That is a significant portion of this book. It just so happens that he lived at a really interesting time in European history, and for that reason we're able to follow him as he interacts with other people, which gives us a justification for giving even more detail and more background information to better understand each of these interactions. And so by the end of it, you have covered about 50 years, 40 to 50 years worth of European history at a very important time period. And even if you're following Voltaire for the bulk of it, just giving background information at these different points of interaction gives you a pretty good history of Europe. And I thought that was one of the most interesting elements of this book. The full name of this book is The Story of Civilization, Volume 9, The Age of Voltaire, A History of Civilization in Western Europe from 1715 to 1756, with special emphasis on the conflict between religion and philosophy. So, not only does that give you the scope, which I think I said 40 to 50 years, let me do the math real quick. That would be just under 40 years, so 39 years. And as the title says, that its particular interest is on this conflict between religion and philosophy. This is not the only time period that's going to be important. We'll actually see it in the remainder of the books in this series, but this is probably one of the first places where you see it so starkly contrasted and so portrayed and argued about in so many different spheres. Many of the other books in this series have certainly touched upon this conflict, and we have seen the development of philosophy and various ideas have been a key part of these books. As you know, Will is actually by training a philosopher, and his first major work was The Story of Philosophy, and that is what gave him the resources to dive into this really big series. I should say that this book came out in 1965, so it was near the end of their lives. They died about a decade after this book came out, and as I've already said, there's 2 more books, and I will get to those. They do have an interesting interaction with the larger series. The series, I believe, when they first started it, and as you read it, I want to say it's around volume 5 that they say, alas, our final volume, but they keep kind of pushing it back. I don't believe that was in this book. I believe this book had every intention of being only part of an ongoing series, but I do know that the next book was one of those books where they said, this is our last volume. So, what can I say about a book that covers the history of Europe, particularly through the narrative of one person, or at least that is the primary mechanism for exploring the history of Europe during this time period? And I should start by saying that you pick up where you left off in the previous volume, which was The Age of Louis XIV, which is focused on developing the early modern state. It's not just creating more ideas and philosophy that came with the Age of Enlightenment, which was the volume before that, but also seeing how that is interacting and engaging with the development of political systems. And this right here is another phase in that development where instead of focusing on political systems so much, it is more of a focus on how philosophy and the state, or philosophy and religion, which sometimes there's, not a strict division there, how that is interacting. And of course, Voltaire is our perfect example for that, hence why this would be the Age of Voltaire. With that, let me tell you the various chapters and sections that you can look forward to if you choose to pick up this book. To tell the story of Voltaire, it actually starts out, the very beginning is a prologue telling you the early life of Voltaire and giving you an idea where he came from, his opportunities in life or lack thereof, and just how exactly he became educated and was on his way to becoming the incredibly famous individual that he eventually became. Then you have to set up some of the political spheres, and as I've already mentioned, there is a key focus on how religion and philosophy are interacting, which of course that is also going to play into the politics politics of the time period, and we have to look at our major players there, which means we're going to see a division between the predominantly Catholic countries, the predominantly Protestant countries, but even within each of those spheres, you're going to have a wide variety of tolerance, a wide variety of philosophical and educational development. And so that's one thing that is really being developed in this book. So the first book within this book is focused on England. So it is actually looking at that 40 or so year time frame, and it is essentially giving us the beginnings of what will eventually be the Industrial Revolution, although that will come into fruition much more so in the subsequent two books. That is, of course, going to give us one of our main pools as we're starting to talk about the different schools of thought when it comes to philosophy and how exactly that is interacting with the Age of Voltaire. And of course, you need to understand the political system, so you are going to have a focus on the various kings and queens of the time period. Most notably are going to be your Georges. The Hanoverian line of the English throne comes over at this time period, and so there is a fair amount of discussion, not just of the English kings, but also their interaction with the other parts of the British Isles, namely Scotland and Ireland. This is going to be a moment of the rise of sentiments in Scotland and the idea of the Highlands and Bonnie Prince Charlie and all that stuff that, you know, does not seem to impede England from continuing on its way to world power. And so you are, of course, going to see that play out in this section. That also sets you up for a major discussion on religion and philosophy, because again, that is a central focus of this book. And so you're going to see that how that plays out in England. England being a predominantly Protestant country, but with a few little odd twists to it. The fact that it is going to be primarily driven by Henry VIII, of course, wanting to remarry, set up for a really peculiar type of Protestantism in England, where it, some would argue, was a bit Catholic light, especially at certain times periods. But that is also what's going to give you this development of various factions, such as the Puritans and eventually the Pilgrims, which, as an American, that has a significance on my country's past. But you can just see how this chapter in this section is trying to set up the larger stage of all the various factions and all the various influences that are creating the tensions between the state, the church, and concepts of philosophy. And then that, of course, is, as usual, because this is a Ariel Durant book, is going to give you a wide variety of discussions of art and music and literature and the stage and just all of the various parts of life that he tries to succinctly cover, and which I think he generally does very well. And I'm sure there is much more you could dive into in any of these individual categories, but I would say that the cadence and the way that he writes and his approach is still very much entertaining and engaging, even if it's not exactly going to be stunning the academic world in terms of producing new scholarship. But it's still certainly going to be an interesting read for most people. You then are, of course, going to move on to France, who is in many ways the great enemy of England at this time period, but also a really important philosophical counterpart. This is going to set the stage for Voltaire and the world in which he is living in. And you are, as usual, going to dive into all sorts of things, questions of morals and manners and the worship of beauty, and then the concept of the play of the mind, which is diving into some of the earliest thoughts of the philosophes that are going to take over Europe and are a big part in France in particular. And that introduces us to Voltaire in France and how he is interacting with all of these various major players and how he is developing major correspondence outside of France, how he's getting to know people in England and people in Austria and people, well, I guess the Holy Roman Empire or the various German-speaking provinces. And that is what is going to be a big part of why we focus on Voltaire, is because of how well connected he is to the rest of the world. And that, of course, then takes you to other parts of the continent. In book 3, you're taking a look at Middle Europe. So you're looking at the Germany of Bach, although Germany did not exist yet, but you're certainly looking into the German-speaking states and their development of some independence and some the early ideas of creating some kind of unity based off of, you know, one thing or another. Of course, we're still more than 100 years off of creating an actual nation state, but you can see the beginnings of a cultural unification that is certainly at odds with elements of the Holy Roman Empire and the larger Habsburg sphere of influence, which brings us to Frederick the Great and Maria Theresa. So you're, of course, looking at the Habsburg Empire. And then you have Voltaire as he makes his way across Europe. He is going to go to Switzerland and how he interacts in Switzerland. You're going to have a lot of discussion of the various scholars and the scientific advancements that are coming at this time period. That's actually going to be the next book. Book 4 is the advancement of learning. And so you're going to have a lot of discussion in this book about the various major players, some of the major branches of science, particularly the earth sciences, so stuff like meteorology, geodesy, geology, geography, Linnaeus and his naming system, and all that is going to be a big part of that book. And then book 5, this is all in many regards setting us up for for what is probably the most important conflict, at least the intellectual conflict that is at the heart of this book, and that is the attack upon Christianity. And so book 5 within this book is looking into the biggest thinkers, especially the ones that represent the biggest extremes within this time period. So you have your atheists, and he goes into detail some of the biggest atheists, but probably the most famous one, or at least the one that he gives the most attention to, is going to be Diderot, who is the writer of the encyclopedia and is a big player in just helping to write down, illustrate ideas, promote ideas. The encyclopedia is this world-changing concept that is going to have a major effect, not in the way that most people expected. A lot of people were really opposed to the encyclopedia on the grounds that it was going to ruin all of the major professions. If you were an expert of some kind and here what you did was in print, oh no, you're going to be out of a job. That actually is not quite what happened. Really what happened is it was a space and place for Diderot to really promote many of his different ideas in regards to philosophical thinking and concepts of education, and really a lot of his ideas about theology are actually going to make its way into the encyclopedia. That is going to give us some of our key players in this, spectrum of belief. And, on one side, you're atheist, and on the other side, I guess you're strict orthodoxy. But, all the different philosophers are going to be somewhere in between, and they're vying for different ideas, different concepts of God, different concepts of natural rights. And all of that is going to be laid out in this section. Probably the most important section of it is going to be when you have Voltaire and Christianity, in which this is his very candid, no pun intended, look at just the engagement between Christianity and the history of Europe. And it is not a very flattering approach, although he does certainly have his moments where I think you could consider him much more flattery than you might expect, because he is known for his sharp wit and just having these really poignant criticisms of people and ideas. But I actually think that, at least based off of the way this book presents it, is you get a pretty thorough idea of how he engaged with a wide variety of ideas, and how in his mind he tried to maybe not make them all work together, but at least have these competing ideas within his mind. And I think that was really what it comes out in this chapter and this exploration of how Voltaire interacted with Christianity. I think that there were much more antagonistic figures from the time period towards not just Christianity, but all sorts of systems and structures and other power sources. I think Voltaire has his very valuable and at times very sharp moments of doubt and calling into question the value of certain systems. But I also think that he gives a much fuller exploration than you might immediately assume. And that leads us to the final chapter in the book, which is, of course, the triumph of philosophy. And so this is essentially his presentation that even though this by no means gets rid of religion at this time period, or any of the other major players that may have been somewhat anti-philosophical or anti-intellectual, you certainly have this moment, this turning point in European history where even if it's not universally accepted, at the very least, you have a very potent faction of Europeans through these correspondences, through these treatises that are being published, through all these different means. They are continuing to promote new ideas and philosophies that will go on to be the hallmarks of the Enlightenment and the defining features of the Enlightenment. Even if they're not universally accepted, they are at least being put into print and being distributed, and we will see that that is going to have continuing repercussions. And I think that's why he ends, of course, this book with that idea of the triumph of the philosophes. And that is a summary of this book. It is one of the most interesting in the series, in my opinion. I've always said that Will Durant is incredibly capable at discussing philosophy and a history of the philosophy. Obviously, that's his training. And I think he's always done well at weaving that into the various parts of his narrative. I think it was a really interesting approach in this book where that is the entirety of the book, is taking Voltaire, taking one of the most pivotal figures in the history of philosophy and using him as a stand-in for studying this entire time period. And I just thought it was incredibly well done. And of course, it has all the other wonderful hallmarks of Will Durant. Again, like I discussed, the way that he writes, that cadence, that the vocabulary that can be a bit flowery and a bit florid, but at the same time, it has a very evocative nature to it that is just a really wonderful way of engaging with history and the topics that he chooses to cover. Who is this book for? Well, probably the biggest thing I've had to clarify going through this series is this a volume that you can pick up on its own, or do you for some reason need to read any volumes before it? And the last few, I would say that just the way they were written, it might be a little hard to pull that volume out and read just that volume. They don't cover as big of a time period, and just for a variety of reasons, it might be a little harder to read it individually. But I do think this returns back to that system. I think that his approach of being so fully invested in the life of Voltaire makes this not necessarily a biography of Voltaire, it's much more than that, but it certainly gives it an approach that I think anyone that has interest in this time period could certainly engage with. Additionally is the question of, do you need to be any kind of expert in this field or anything like that? And I would say certainly not. I do think that if you don't have any knowledge of European history, or at least a basic understanding of the various time periods, it might be a little much. There's going to be a lot of names that you might not recognize. But if you do have some fundamental understanding of the Enlightenment and many of the major players, then you certainly not only would enjoy this, you would also find new material in it because it is just so wide in its scope. I think there's also a great deal of additional information that could really benefit anyone. So who is this not for? Well, if you're not into history and you certainly are not interested in this time period and this approach, then this may not be for you. Also, it's a huge book. But as I've already said, I do think if you wanted to read just one book in the series, you could read this. You don't need to feel any need to read the book before it. I haven't read the book after it yet, so I don't know, maybe you will want to read the book that comes after it. I will find out. But I really would like to know what you guys think about this book. And of course, I always want to know your thoughts on this series. We are getting near the end. I will probably try and find another similar series when I finish this. And please let me know in the comments what you think another series is I should take on afterwards. I really want to hear from you guys. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.